Thank you so much for watching today. Melina here. If you have not already taken the poll that was posted in my retrospective video, I'm just going to link to it down below. The poll will be closing on the Friday of this week, which would be the 28th, I believe, the 28th of April. Right now the bisexual video is beating Buffy, so if you want to see one or the other, either vote in that poll or you leave a comment below on either this video or the previous one, and it will be counted, and then on Friday I'll announce the winner. And yay! So I mentioned before that I wanted to do a video series on feminism, kind of doing like videos that sort of bridge the gap between academic feminism and sort of everyday working women type of feminism, because I feel that feminism, in order for it to really thrive, should be accessible to everyone. And I had sort of struggled about how I was going to do an introduction to this series, but then the pop culture fairies gave me a wonderful gift. Elisabeth Moss, who will be playing the role of Offred, she made a comment in an interview about her opinion on the Handmaid's Tale television adaptation, and in a way the book as well. And she said, "For me, it's not a feminist story. It is a human story, because women's rights are human rights. I never approach anything with any sort of political agenda. I approach it from a very human place." Now, there are certainly levels that we could unpack with that comment, but what makes it very potent and a good avenue for discussion is that her statement is similar to what the book's author, Margaret Atwood, has also said about her work. Margaret Atwood labels herself as a humanist. She's never really called herself a feminist. And in her opinion, what makes a work feminist is that the work is created with the feminist movement in mind. And therefore, she herself does not view her work or The Handmaid's Tale specifically as being a feminist work, in her opinion, because she did not write it with the movement in mind. She was writing it based on a bunch of different issues, including religion, socialism at the time, and I think that, like many women of her generation, second wave feminism may have not spoken to her in other ways, even if she were herself, and as it clearly seems, inclined to talk about women's rights issues. This is interesting to me because it leads to the discussion of, what do we mean when we call a text, whether it be a book, a film, a television show, feminist? What is the criteria? Because in theory you can call anything feminist, but what is it really supposed to mean? And for me, I actually kind of agree with Margaret Atwood in the sense that for me to consider or to feel a work is feminist, in capital F feminist, it must be talking about the sort of structural hardships and realities of being a woman socially and politically, or politically, in our society. It very much tackles and is about the female reality and the hardships that are there from being just inherently a woman. For me, one of the things that was very hard for me as sort of a young feminist was having to accept certain books having the label of feminist that I quite frankly just did not agree with. The biggest ones were books like Jane Eyre and The Gone with the Wind, especially the character of Scarlett O'Hara, which are both viewed as like these very proto-feminist texts. And my problem for that has always been that the texts are about one woman and uplifting this one woman via the backs of other women. And for me, it doesn't mean that these books aren't good. They're not empowering in certain ways, and they don't have value of being read under a female or feminist lens. But to say that they are just inherently, intrinsically feminist texts, I find a problem, because they are dealing more so with the individual and not the sort of universal larger issues of what it means to be a woman in our society. If I were to like make a list of like my top 5 big F, capital F feminist works, it would be, this is just my opinion, it would be A Woman on the Edge of Time. Number 2 would be The Color Purple. 3 would be A Handmaid's Tale, The Handmaid's Tale, regardless of Atwood's opinion on it. 4 would be The Well of Loneliness, and 5 would be Clarissa by Samuel Richardson. And each of these books, what I think makes them what makes them such good feminist texts is that they are dealing with issues of class, race, gender, sexuality, and the female experience, and how being a woman is already a struggle in and of itself. But when you add other things to it, it creates this heavy burden of what it means to be a woman in our world. For example, you know, The Color Purple, dealing specifically with like race and gender, about how for Black women, it is not just the experience of white patriarchal racism, but also dealing with the sexism and misogyny from other Black men, and how that lack of having that Black male companionship and desire to be uplifted by your male partner, how that does great damage to the female spirit. And The Well of Loneliness, dealing with sort of, you know, being a woman who is a lesbian or even in some readings transgender, and even with all the money you have, being limited in what you can experience, about being able to experience love because of the A, notions of gender, and B, because of your sexuality. Or something like Woman on the Edge of Time, which deals with mental illness. And even Clarissa, which I think is probably more of a reach for some people, but for me, what makes Clarissa such a wonderful feminist text to read is that it really is about the fact that being a woman in the 18th century, even if you had wealth, you really wore the pawn of your male relatives. And how even if you were smart and intelligent, if you did not have a man there to sort of protect you with noble intentions, you would just be screwed, because you yourself had no power even if you were intelligent. Your body, your mind is not your own, and you are susceptible to the whims of your father and your brother. And those narratives are important feminist narratives because they are calling to attention the unfairness of these realities and these existences, whether it be grounded in our reality or be a speculative work like A Woman on the Edge of Time or The Handmaid's Tale. And that political social leaning is what makes them feminist, because they are directly discussing those issues within their narrative. Whereas certain other stories, like in my opinion Jane Eyre and Gone with the Wind, are empowerment female narratives. They are empowering a kind of woman, and that experience may consequently empower you. As an example, I would say, you know, I think that Big Little Lies is a type of feminist narrative because it is dealing specifically with the issues of female domestic violence, of motherhood, of rape, and specifically female pain and issues without fetishizing it, while, you know, bringing women together. It does faulty a little bit on class and race, but it does very much discuss what it means to be a woman and putting yourself in that emotional psyche place in a specifically female point of view. And not just one woman, but women, multiple. Whereas a narrative like, another Reese Witherspoon vehicle, Legally Blonde, I've never really been able to accept it or see it as a big F feminist story, because it really is about Elle Woods, and it really is about uplifting her and empowering her, while and empowering just a specific kind of women, and not about empowering women as a whole, especially when the narrative itself mocks a lesbian feminist and makes her sort of like a straw man feminist character. Like, I think that sort of undermines the supposed female empowerment message of the film overall, but that to me is the difference between feminist and empowering stories, and they can both be good. It does not take away from Legally Blonde that it's not a capital F feminist movie. It's still a very good movie. It's still a very empowering movie for women. It just, at least to me, is not feminist. And even me saying that, I'm not, you know, feminist, big honcho, academic person. I I'm not the end-all be-all of what makes an item or text feminist. This is just my personal opinion, and bring it up to discussion because we should be discussing this, because so often things get labeled as feminist, but we're not really thinking about what it means then for it to be feminist. And I end up going back to Atwood's statement about the movement being in mind, the politics being in mind, because feminism is political, and it should be treated as such. And if a narrative is afraid to be political, afraid to take a stand, afraid to really make a solid point about the female experience and the unfairness of it in many cases, then it sort of fails for me. And especially if it's not intersectional, or at least discusses intersectionality in some way, it fails because it refuses to challenge the social norms and the patriarchy in a substantial way. So going back to the Handmaiden tale, is it feminist? Absolutely. I mean, Margaret Atwood's opinion on it are valid because she wrote the book. But at this point, the narrative has sort of grown past her intentions of it. Death of the author and all that. If you're not familiar with that term, I'll link to it below. But basically, death of the author means that you are treating the text as a text in and of itself, separate from the author's intentions. And even if Atwood herself does not call herself a feminist, her work for so long has been about discussing gender and social restrictions of women, that even if she doesn't call herself a feminist, her work speaks volumes for what her values are. She's obviously not calling herself a humanist because she doesn't want to offend men. She's calling it that way probably because she doesn't agree with second wave or third wave feminism in terms of other reasons, which, you know what, there are valid reasons not to. And I'm going to get into that whole label game another time. But when it comes to the Handmaiden tale, it is so political and so very strong at directing, and it's so very brilliantly addressing so many intrinsical female issues that it is feminist just by going in that way, because feminism is sometimes larger than the individual, and so it's larger than Margaret Atwood's intentions for the novel. And even if Elisabeth Moss and Margaret Atwood don't want to call it feminist, we feminists have claimed it as such. And therefore, it matters to call it that, because by removing the label of feminist from it and trying to say that, oh, it's not political, you are really sort of devaluing the book, in my opinion, because it is political. And to say otherwise is sort of deluding yourself into trying to make it accessible to everyone. But at this point, that's a silly statement, because the book has never been out of print since it was published. It is one of the staple points of speculative fiction, of feminist fiction. It has already been discussed on all these levels. And so for me, it is one of the most perfect feminist texts, because it is brave, it is political, it is strong, and it is very much talking about a human experience that is female. Some people want to depoliticize the book, which is political, guys. It's about a government that controls women's bodies. I don't know how you can get. And so I raised the question to you guys: what texts do you think are feminist, and which do you think are not? And do you think it matters to your enjoyment of the text whether it's one or the other, or both? And do you think that The Handmaiden Tale is a feminist novel? Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please thumbs up and subscribe and share to anyone you think might want to hear my annoying voice. I am looking very forward to speaking with you soon, and the next video coming up will be on the originals. We didn't have any Riverdale this week, but it does not mean we still can't talk about the CW and their weird nonsense.